I want to get information about the potential liability that might attach to certain activities. So you can imagine companies are trying some new innovative technological things, and the question is, are these new technologies going to create liability for these companies? And and if the study is, we want to try to find out, what do these companies think their liability is going to be? What do these companies think their liability is going to be? How should we do a study on this topic? So that's a great question, good question for our purposes, because it raises some interesting challenges for collecting data. So you know what your question is, you have a clear question, you know what you're going to ask. But the problem is how to ask. And the reason why it's a problem is if you go to some corporation that's implementing some new technology, and you want to ask them, what kind of liability is this new technology going to create? Are they going to give you an answer at all? And if they give you an answer, is there any chance it's going to be a straight answer? Is there any chance that they're going to honestly answer that question? Going up, it's like going up to somebody and saying like, tell me all the crimes you've committed. Tell me how much you should be sued for. Nobody's going to answer that. Not nobody. I suppose some people are compulsively honest, but most people will try to evade answering a question like that if they have something to hide. And so the question then becomes, how do we answer a question when the people we want to ask the question don't want to answer the questions? And I think here, this is an issue I've run into in my own research. So one of the things I wanted to study was how much does litigation cost, right? I don't know if I mentioned this to you already, but how much does litigation cost? How much are big companies spending preparing for litigation? Now the problem is, if you go to a company and ask them, tell me how much you're spending to prepare for litigation, they don't want to tell you. Because as a matter of legal defense strategy, the last thing you want to tell the world is how much it will cost them to defend a case, right? Because then now all of a sudden, the people who might sue them, the lawyers who might sue them, have a bargaining chip. They know that you're paying this much money every time they sue you. So you're not going to get a straight answer. So can you get any answer at all? And in my case, the challenge was, do they stand to benefit? Is there some benefit that they can gain from sharing this information? And is there some way I can protect them if I share this information? Now, in the case of the question I was asking, I had the advantage that there were groups. There were groups of corporate leaders who thought it was very important that there be empirical research on the cost of litigation, because it would assist efforts of the courts to come up with new rules to reduce the cost of litigation. And because the companies wanted to reduce the cost of litigation, they had an incentive to give me data so that I could give data to the courts with this information. So that solves problem number one, which is, do you have a reason to give me the data at all? How do you solve problem number two, which is you're still worried about the effect revealing the data is going to have? And so for me, a big part of my my pitch, my sales pitch, so to speak, was coming up with a protocol for collecting data that would protect the companies from what they were worried about. And so in my case, I said, this is what I'm going to do. If you want to submit information to me anonymously, I'm going to make a questionnaire. It's going to be a long and detailed questionnaire. But the questions are going to be such that, based on your answers, I cannot determine your identity. So I will ask how many employees you have, but I will give wide ranges of the number of employees so that I can't determine, based on the specific number, who you are, right? I'll ask what type of industry you're in, but I won't ask you to identify your address, your location, or the name of your company, for example. And then I will ask questions about, how much are you spending, what types of cases do you have, what types of expenses do you have, and so on. And you can submit this survey to me in one of two ways. I've set up a website. Are you familiar with SurveyMonkey? These free websites where you can set up. So I went to SurveyMonkey, and it turns out you can, if you pay extra, you get to make a questionnaire. And instead of the website being called SurveyMonkey, it's called research.net, which sounds much better. So for $700, I was willing to pony up $700 so that I could tell people it would be a research.net study instead of a SurveyMonkey study. But in any event, so they could submit to this website, and I set up the survey, the online survey, not to track the IP addresses of people who were submitting. Now they had to take my word for it that I had made the settings that way. And I said, look, if you don't want to take my word for it, here's what you can do. I will make available a PDF of the survey. You can print it out on paper. You can fill it in on paper, and then you can send an envelope with no return address, right? And I will just get this piece of paper with the survey in it, and I won't know where it came from. So you can do it either way. So some companies did it one way, and some companies did it the other way. And I said all of the data would be stored securely on a password-protected website and so on. And so that's what I did to try to protect the anonymity and the confidentiality of the results. And I said what I will do is I will analyze the data, but I won't report any individual company's answers. I will only report the aggregate data. So what's the average value, right? What's the range of value? So remember when we talked about statistics, we talked about standard deviation, mean, median. That was the stuff I was going to report, not any information about any one company. So that's what I did to try to protect anonymity and confidentiality. Even so, it took years to get companies to agree to do this, and I ended up getting data from about 120 companies, something like that. So it's a decent sample given the limitations that I was facing, but not a huge sample. So in the case of asking companies the extent to which new technology might create liabilities for them, even if you could create assurances of anonymity and confidentiality, you still have the challenge of, well, how do you convince them it benefits them to say anything at all? Like, that's a harder question. And then you might say to yourself, either are there questions to ask that are less sensitive, that still inform my research project? Or is there somebody else I could ask that might be more willing to talk, right? So, maybe talking to experts in the field, technology experts, legal practitioners, or law professors, or whoever you think might have an answer that you still care about, but that might be more willing to share their information. But this is a real challenge. Like, there are lots of great legal questions, empirical questions, that don't get answered, not because they're not good questions, but because you can't get the data. I remember one of my most distinct memories from grad school when I was getting my PhD in economics. Has anyone here heard of Steve Levitt, the book Freakonomics? Okay, Freakonomics. Okay, so Steve Levitt is the economist that basically did all the cool research in Freakonomics. So he's at the University of Chicago. And so I was a student in the PhD program at the University of Chicago. And so I went to Steve Levitt with this idea I had. There had been a recent change in the law governing sentencing for people who had been imprisoned for possession of crack cocaine. I don't know if you're familiar with crack cocaine, but it's a particular type of cocaine that's very highly addictive, even more so than regular cocaine. And the sentences are extremely high. It's a very punitive criminal sentencing regime under federal law. And there was a change one year that retroactively changed the sentencing to make it more in line with other drug offenses. And as a consequence, there's a very unusual situation that seemed like a perfect situation for an empirical study, which was, does the length of a sentence affect your likelihood of recidivism? And here's a situation where all of a sudden, one day, everybody's sentences got changed. So you might have had a bunch of people, all of whom were sentenced to 10 years in prison, so they all committed the same crime the first time. But one of them, and all of their sentences were reduced, let's say, to 5 years or something. But what that means is if I had been in jail for 9 years, I get out of jail today. If I had been in jail for 6 years, I get out of jail today. Which means two people, right, who committed the same crime are getting out of jail at the same time, but for reasons completely unrelated to them, right? It was exogenous. It was the government, suddenly making a sudden change, right? So it's exogenous. It's not due to something. It wasn't because they did good behavior, right? It wasn't because one of them had good behavior, so they got out early. Just one happens to have been in for 6 years, one for 9, one for 7, one for 5. They all get out at the same time. So here you have a group of people, all who committed the same crime, but who have different sentence lengths, right? Usually, different sentence length means somebody did worse crime less. But here, same crime, but different sentence lengths because of the sudden change in the law. So I went to Steve Levitt and I said, this is great. You never had an exogenous change in people's imprisonment. But here's this change. What I want to do is track everybody who got released because of this change in the law and see at what rates they commit crime. Keep track of their commission of crime. And that would be a causal identification, right? Because their differences in their sentences is exogenous due to something outside of themselves. It's as if it was an experiment. It wasn't an experiment, but it was as if it was an experiment. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. And he said, William, that is a fantastic research idea. He said, that's really good causal identification, really elegant strategy, really important question that lawyers and economists really care about. Don't do it. I said, excuse me? He said, you'll never get the data. He said, you'll never get the data. Because the thing is, in the United States, criminal enforcement is handled by many different jurisdictions. There's the federal government, there's the state government, and there's 50 different states, right? Plus the District of Columbia. So there's 52 different jurisdictions. Only one of those 52, the federal government, has any consolidated reporting of criminal records. Which means I would have to collect by hand, right, the records of all of these people from 51 other different jurisdictions in order to do this study. It's impossible. It never happened. So he said, look, this is just one of those studies that's a fantastic study. This is never going to happen because it's just too hard to get the data. So that's just life. I mean, that was an important lesson for me to learn. That sometimes you have a fantastic research question, but just you don't have the data. And of course, a lot of times you have the opposite problem: is you have lots of data, you can't think of a research question. But that's on you. That's up to you. You just keep thinking and try to develop a good research question. Any other questions about experiments or research design or data gathering?
Talking about sampling, I've often seen this sort of formula for sampling, and it seems apparently there's a point at which gathering more samples is not worth the effect it will have on parts, which is why sort of these political samples will be around 2,400 or something like that. So what is this sort of phenomenon? What is this formula?
So you can look, they have these things online. You can look up, if you Google like power calculator, right? It'll talk about if you have a question in mind and you think you know sort of what the data are going to look like. You have a guess as to what the data are going to look like. You can put in your guesses as to what the data will look like. And you can ask yourself, what's the effect size I want to be able to detect, right? Because what we said, low power means you can't detect small effect sizes. So you want to say, I want to have an effect size of 0.05 or 0.1, 0.5, whatever the effect size is. Bigger effect size means smaller sample, right? So you put that into the power calculator. It's off the top of my head, I don't even remember how to do the power calculation myself. It's actually, in principle, as these things go, it's actually not that complicated, but I don't remember how to do it. But you can just go to one of the websites.
I just tried it yesterday. It's available online. So the different formula depending upon which statistical program you're using. But it's available online. You have to type in power calculation sample size.
Yeah. So I mean, you get there's more than one. I mean, there's several websites where you put this data in, and it'll just tell you you need 200 observations, or you need 6,000 observations in order to detect a certain effect size.
But in principle, the more the sample, the more the accuracy. Like, why is there this formula in the first place?
Well, so well, it's because there's always a trade-off. If you had access to the entire population, of India for no cost, you would always collect data on the entire population. Right? You would never take a sample because you always have more power with a bigger set of observations. But the trade-off is if a larger sample costs more to collect, then you have to ask yourself, when do I stop collecting? And it's either when I run out of money, right, or it's when I've collected a large enough sample that I am fairly confident that the sample, that the effect size that I'm trying to measure will be statistically significant. Right? So if you're saying to yourself, the question I want to ask, my alternate hypothesis, the hypothesis I'm trying to show is true. So the null hypothesis might be no effect, and the alternate hypothesis that I think is true is that the effect will be 20 percentage points. Okay, how many observations minimum do I need to be able to detect an effect of that size? If I have more than that, that's great, that's even better, but at a minimum, how many do I have to have? And so what these, if you're doing a survey research, for example, and the idea is, well, the effect size I want to be able to detect is 5 percentage points. So then you put that into your power calculation and you get, 600 or something. And then that's the sample you take. Because you're, as a surveyor, your client says, I want you to detect an effect with this precision. So you're going to choose the lowest cost survey to generate that level of precision, right? So that's why you do the power calculation.
Another question that I have is, what's the best way of getting a representative sample for cases, specifically?
That is a good question. So representative, the problems associated with getting representative samples. So this is a very big problem, right? I alluded to it a couple of times during the lecture. In experiments, lab experiments, the big problem is people who volunteer for lab experiments are not representative of the population, right? But of course, this is a problem in many other areas as well. For example, what if you want to do a study where you're collecting cases and you're looking for the patterns in the cases? How did justices decide cases that are brought by women versus men, or cases that are brought by corporations versus individuals, or the government, or whatever? How do I know I'm getting a representative sample of cases? So you have to think about what are the sources available to you for collecting cases. So the easiest way to collect cases, presumably, is from online resources. And so in the United States, there are three now, companies that provide online searchable reporters. So it's Westlaw, Lexis, and Bloomberg. Are any of them operating in Yeah, Lexis. So you know what I'm talking about. Lexis, okay. So traditionally what legal empirical researchers would do is they would go on Lexis and they would run a search that would describe the kind of case that they were looking for. And the list of cases would come back, right? So they'd take those cases, they'd print them out or whatever, and then they would code those cases. Now, that's actually a very problematic way of coding, of generating a sample of cases. For a couple of reasons. So it depends on the court that you're dealing with. If you're dealing with the Supreme Court, every Supreme Court case is on Lexis, so that's fine, not a big deal. But at least in the United States, not every lower court case, every appellate court or trial district court case, not all of those opinions are on Lexis, only some. And what gets reported and what's get not is partially chosen by the judge. The judge asks the reporter to report the case. And sometimes the reporter, even if the judge doesn't ask, decides it's an important enough case or an interesting enough case to include. So the problem then becomes what cases you see depends on the choices that judges made about what cases they wanted you to see, right? And what choices Nexus editors thought that you want to see, not the whole set of cases out there, right? And so that becomes a real issue of when we run a search on Lexis and do empirical research based on those results, it's not a representative sample of all cases. It's a representative sample of cases on Lexis, right? So this is a real issue. So, Friday, I don't know. So how many people have been getting the papers? Have you been getting the papers? Who hasn't been getting the papers?
Not yesterday.
Not yesterday.
Not even.
Okay, but you got the other paper. Okay, I think maybe there's an issue with yesterday, but before you.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I thought that today morning the mail that was sent, I haven't received it, but I checked my spam folder, it was there. Other mails are going to the inbox. So please check your spam folder, it might be there.
Okay.
So, I mean, today only it happened.
Okay.
Other mails were in the inbox. About 9:60.
Yeah, it happens, right? It happens. Okay, so let me know if you haven't been getting anything. And also, we've been collecting the slides, but I don't think they've been distributed yet. Okay, so I will ask to have them sent out. So I think I think there was a misunderstanding about when to distribute them. So I'll ask to have them sent out. Okay. So for Friday, the paper will be about these dismissals, motions to dismiss a case. If the pleadings are defective, if there's something wrong with the pleadings, you can dismiss a case. And so the early studies that were done on the effect of this case, the Twombly case, which you saw on the slide there, it's a U.S. Supreme Court case from 2007 that changed the rule. The first studies that were done, we went on Westlaw and Lexis and looked for district court decisions that would either grant or deny a motion to dismiss. And what they found was there was a rise in the number of district court opinions that were granting motions to dismiss after Twombly. And so one might conclude that Twombly caused a rise in the rate of dismissals. Now, I went back and I got a different data source. I looked at administrative records that the courts kept. There's a database of all of the cases. And I said, what's the rate at which cases are being dismissed? Turns out there's zero change, like literally zero. It's very precisely estimated. And this was an example of a case where I had to test a null hypothesis that was different from zero to say that, no, the effect really is zero. And so why the difference? Why the difference? Well, I think the reason was when you decide a motion to dismiss and you're a judge, you also have to decide whether or not to write an opinion to go along with your decision. Now, when you are dismissing a case, you want to kind of justify yourself as the plaintiff who now no longer can pursue their claim. So you're more likely to write an opinion than if you're not dismissing a case. You're also more likely to write an opinion if you have something to talk about in your opinion, which means if you're going to dismiss a case and there was a Supreme Court decision that just made it easier to dismiss a case, you'll probably be more likely to write an opinion after that Supreme Court case because now you have something to talk about. Before, you didn't really have any case to cite, so you don't write an opinion. So it's not that more cases were dismissed after Twombly, it's that more judges wrote opinions dismissing. When they dismissed a case, they were more likely to write an opinion after Twombly. Right? So this is an example of this problem of representative sample based on cases, right? When you're looking at cases. Is you have to work.
It's like the judges thought that somebody is observing.
Yes, I mean, it's brilliant. The judges think people are more likely to read them after Twombly because everyone's talking about Twombly. And so they were part of a conversation at that point that wasn't happening before. So that was an issue anyway. So that was a case where if you look at Lexis, you think it's gone up, but it actually had not gone up. So that's the concern. So what ideally you want to do is you want to try to find a source that is itself a representative sample of cases and then draw from that. The other issue that arises when you do Lexis searches is you have to make sure the search terms you're putting in are actually capturing what you want to capture, right? If you're including, so for example, here's another example of the same studies that used for Twombly. The old case before Twombly was 50 years old. It was called Conley. And so what one of the studies did is it did a search for every time a case mentioned Conley and used those cases as its sample. The problem is you don't have to cite Conley to dismiss a case or not dismiss a case, right? And as a consequence, we don't know whether judges who cite Conley are more likely to dismiss than judges who don't, right? So that was another example of a case where if you're not very careful about how you search Lexis, you might end up with a sample that is not even close to representative of all the cases. It is representative of all the cases that are published on Lexis and that cite Conley. And if, as long as you're clear that that's what your sample is, it's internally valid. You'll have internal validity, but there will be no external validity because it won't tell you anything about other cases. Right? So that's the concern. Now, if you're looking at, say, if you're going to, say, the Indian Supreme Court's website, and I think the coverage there is pretty comprehensive, if not completely comprehensive, and you just scrape the website and pull all the cases from the website, then at least you've got all of the Indian Supreme Court's judgments on merits here. So that would be a more representative sample. But I don't know, is that what you're, there's other issues with representativeness as well.
Of course, there's the problem of sampling in terms of what, so it's not only that, one thing is you can scrape every case from 1993 or whatever, and accept the errors which are on the court's website themselves, which are quite common. You'll get all orders from 1993. But then there's a problem of how do you select enough representation from each case type and each subject matter.
Right, sure.
You can't analyze, so if you want to get into a specific judgment and you want to see how the judgment affects petitioners or respondents, you can't analyze that through scraping alone. You'll have to read the judgment.
Right.
And I don't want to read 1,300.
Okay, right, okay, I see, exactly, so very fair. So there's a couple ways to deal with this. So one is you have to decide, in some sense, think about ahead of time, is there a subset of cases that are what the cases you really care about? So for example, if the cases you really care about are IPR cases, right? Or if the cases you really care about are PILs, right? And just look at those, right? And then you won't have external validity in terms of, criminal cases, but at least for the cases you look at, you'll have a much bigger sample because you're sampling from a smaller population, so you're getting more of the population in your sample. On the other hand, if what you really care about is sort of a broad overview of what the court's doing in general, you're not going to read thousands and tens of thousands of opinions. So then you need to sample. Now, if you really don't care about specific case types, and you just want to get a representative sample, then you want to do random sampling, right? You want to sample randomly. So what that means is, you put all the numbers in a list, all the cases in a list, right? Number them 1 through, 60,000 or however many it is over the history of the court. And, no, not that many. But anyway, however many thousand it is. And then you get a random number generator. And you say, okay, I did my power calculation. I'm going to get a sample of 200. Maybe it's not even a power calculation. Maybe the only power you care about is your power to keep reading before you collapse, right? You said, look, I can read 200 cases before I go crazy. So that's 200 cases. So you get a random number generator to pick numbers between 1 and 10,000, however many cases there are. And you just, whatever numbers come up, those are the cases you read, right? That would be a truly random sample from the entire set of cases. But you can do like a stratified sampling. You say, no, the cases I really care about are constitutional cases, or PILs. So I'm just going to look at those and sample within that group. But it really depends on the research question, like whether to narrow it down by year, narrow it down by bench size, narrow it down by subject matter. And then, once you've narrowed it down to whatever subset you think is worth focusing on. If it's still too many cases, then say to yourself, all right, now I'm just going to do random, like truly random sampling. I'm not going to say, oh, I'm just going to read the short ones or something like that. Is that more to the point, I guess?
What about content analysis? I mean, I'm not really sure what question he's asking, but I suppose one of the ways to go through a large number of cases is obviously with the LexisNexis problem that you just mentioned. I mean, a particular case, like there was no logic to it. Like you said, the judges didn't really have to cite it to dismiss. But if you can come up with a very logical correlation between certain terms and phrases, certain citations, and a particular case type, then any computer program that does content analysis can pull that for you.
Control F.
Yeah. No, they're much more sophisticated versions.
Yes, it's true.
So I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah. So one of the things that can be done, there are limits to this that are important too, but there are a lot of possibilities here. So, for example, let's say you pull all the judgments of the Supreme Court, or you get you're able to talk one of the SCC or one of the companies that is a reporter for the Supreme Court. You talk them into giving you the batch download of the cases. Even if it's PDFs, you can convert the PDFs to text files, right? And then what you have now is a database of text, right? And then you can parse the text, right, in order to look for certain phrases. If there are phrases that show up consistently, right, in every opinion that identify as a certain type of opinion, right, then you can do that. Or let's say you're looking for the judgments of the opinions of a particular justice, right? You can search for that justice's name. And narrow it down that way using text-based searches. And there are ways to even set, so you can write a computer program to scrape the court's website. Then you can write a computer program, right, to scrape or parse your own data, right, and pull out the specific cases that you want to pull out. Now there's an additional step. You might ask, well, wait a minute, why stop there? Maybe you don't even need to read the cases. Why not parse the text in order to code the variables? And the answer there is, well, maybe. It depends on what you're trying to code, right? So, and it also depends on how the data is formatted. So if it's structured data, right? So and this is where it helps not to get a PDF, but to see if you can actually get a download from like SCC or something. If it's structured data, right? So there are already in the data, it has a separate category for judges, for the justices, or has a separate category for subject matter. Now you can just pull that out and use it. If it's unstructured data, if it's just the text of the opinion,
Yeah, that's hard.
then you have to train the computer to recognize the patterns that indicate the outcome. And it turns out that
It's incredibly
hard to do.
It's
very hard to do.
impossible.
And for some basic questions, I think you can train a computer to do it, but it turns out it's actually really hard to do. So I do think this is an emerging frontier in terms of machine learning. The extent to which you can get machines to be sufficiently good at recognizing patterns in the data that they can actually code cases themselves. But currently, most of the work that has any sort of nuanced case characteristics still requires human coding. Questions about data or experiments?
Okay, that is about the cases he's saying. Like in the cases you're analyzing them and then you're building a theory, right? So what if you have to study the impact of a law? Suppose a new law comes up, it's good or bad. So is it possible to create a representative sample? Because you have certain number of cases and out of that you randomly select and make a representative sample. Still it's a possibility. But in other studies, for example, you are studying the effects of a particular new policy which has come up through a new amendment in the law. So is it possible to get a representative sample?
Well, the answer, again, the somewhat frustrating but true answer is it depends on the specific question, right? It depends on the specific question. So, and where to look. So, for example, if your question is, there's a change in the law governing motions to dismiss, then the data you're going to look at is cases, right? On the other hand, what if the change in the law is a change in the law reflecting whether hospitals are liable for the negligence of their doctors in treating patients? There, the outcome that presumably you're looking for is, do more people die in hospitals after the law is changed than before, right? Something like that, right? Does the change in law affect the incentives of hospitals to ensure that their doctors are not being negligent? Something like that. I'm just making something up. So there, you might not want to look at cases at all, right? You might want to look at data on mortality of hospital patients, right? And then the question is, how do you get that data, right? Maybe it's easier to get, maybe it's harder to get. But, you know, where you even look for data, forget about being representative sample, where you even look for data at all depends on the questions you pose. Now you might say to yourself, well, let's say there's a change in the law, you know, governing hospital liability, and you're worried about its effect on patient health. Or there's a change in the law on what is the standard for being held liable in a traffic accident? Is that going to make people drive more safely? Will there be fewer traffic accidents if you increase the punishment for causing a car crash? Presumably the data that you want to look for isn't court opinions, it's actual, you know, car crashes or patient mortality in hospitals. If you were to try to look for evidence by looking at cases, you say, okay, I'm going to look at cases that litigate the issue of liability in a traffic accident. That may be a very poor way to get a sample. I'm speaking of unrepresented. That would be a very unrepresentative sample because after all, most of the time when there's a car crash and somebody caused the car crash, there isn't necessarily a lawsuit, right? They might just pay the person on the spot or their insurance company might pay and without any lawsuit being filed. And so only some small fraction of cases that involve a car crash end up becoming cases in the legal system. Likewise, if somebody dies at a hospital, not all the time will that end up in a lawsuit in the legal system. It might be settled outside of court. And so if that's true, then the cases going into the court system are cases that are not the normal cases. They're the unusual cases that have something went wrong. The parties couldn't work out an agreement between themselves. And what you may see there is, there may be no change in cases that are in court. You know, you still might see 50% of the time plaintiffs win and 50% lose, and it doesn't even change, even though the standard becomes much more generous to plaintiffs afterwards. Because the change isn't happening in court, the change is happening out of court. Many more people might get compensation out of court, even if the same number of people get compensation in court. And so that's a situation where maybe you don't want to look at cases at all. You want to look at other data, because the cases will be unrepresentative. And some types of data are, you know, representativeness is a bigger problem than other types of data. So, you know, cases, you know, might be unrepresentative for this purpose. On the other hand, if there are records of car crashes, government records, you might say, oh, that's a better data source. But even then you might be worried. You might say, well, but not all car crashes are reported, right? Many people in a car crash, they don't wait for the police to come. They just sort of, you know, work things out, or they just drive away. You know, how do you deal with that problem, right? Well, if you think that the tendency of people to report their car crashes to the police doesn't change after the law, then that's okay. It's equally unrepresentative before and after. And since all you care about is the change, if it's equally unrepresentative before and after, then the change, if it's up, it will still be up. If it's down, it will still be down. But if the tendency of people to report the crash changes after the law, then it may be hard to detect the change in the number of crashes. Right? The number of crashes could go up. The number of reported crashes could go up, even if the total number of crashes goes down. So one example of this is in the area of things like domestic violence and sex crimes. Right? So if you look at statistics on the number of rapes that occur on college campuses in the United States, the numbers are just skyrocketing. And it's not because the number of rapes are skyrocketing. It's because the willingness of victims to report to authorities is skyrocketing. And so this is a real issue, and this is a real problem that many university administrators face, is the better job they do at protecting victims, the worse their numbers look. Because the places that protect victims the most, victims report. And the places that don't protect victims, nobody reports. They're still victimized, but they don't report it. And so this is a real problem. It's many of the universities that are actually doing a good job, their statistics look really bad. But and this is that issue of reporting.
Okay, I just have a suggestion. So I don't know what are the time constraints in, I think, Thursday and Friday, but if for 10 minutes you can discuss about the new tax policy which is coming in US. Because there are certain statistical studies which have been done
Okay.
to talk about the new tax plan which has come.
The one that's currently in the U.S.
I'm
Senate?
talking about the Trump tax plan,
Yeah.
which has just been passed. Because there were a lot of studies which were conducted, and on the basis of those research and empirical studies, they have said, okay, this is the tax plan which is good. So maybe sometime 10 minutes you can talk about.
I mean, it's a lot to talk. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in tax policy. Let me begin by saying that I'm not an expert in tax policy. I know the basics of the economics of tax policy, but I'm far from an expert. I'm also not an expert on the Trump tax plan. I will say...
No, because it's been debated in the mainstream,
Oh,
and
sure.
in our country also, in
Yeah,
India
yeah.
also, we are going to revive the direct tax
Yeah.
policy. So I think it's a civil society issue
Yeah.
which everybody should be applying their mind to. So
Sure, no, it definitely,
Maybe-
that's fair. That's a very good point. I guess what I'll say is so one of the things that's been in the news a lot in the United States about this is these reports that have come out projecting the effect of the tax plan on the deficit, on the debt, and projecting the effect that the plan will have on different groups of taxpayers. Right? So those, to be clear, those are not themselves empirical studies, right? Those are reports that look at empirical studies of past tax plans and past tax changes, and try to extrapolate from those results to make predictions about what will happen under the new tax plan. So, for example, when the what is it, the Joint Committee on Taxation, I forget who it is, when they say the Senate's tax plan will increase the debt by $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's not an empirical study. It's a prediction about the future. Right? It's a prediction about the future. It's a projection based on the way their model, right? Their model of how changes in the tax rates affect tax revenue. Now that model is based on earlier empirical studies, right? That look at past changes in revenue. And so, there is an empirical component to it, but it's kind of one step removed from what we're seeing in the news for the most part. It is true as an empirical matter that when politicians say that if we cut rates, it will increase revenue, that just generally is not true. That's just generally
what's happening in India also. We
because-
have the Modi government saying we'll cut rates so it will increase the revenue.
So, as a historical, empirical matter, that does not happen. Ronald Reagan came in the early 1980s and said cutting rates is good for the economy and it will raise government revenue, so everybody should be happy. He was half right. It was good for the economy, but it greatly reduced government revenue. And of course, that's not necessarily good for that part was not necessarily good for the economy. It could be bad for the economy. So yeah, as a historical matter, that relationship empirically is not verified. In theory, it could be true. So you could imagine a country unlike the United States where tax rates are extraordinarily high, right? So if you have marginal tax rates that are 90% or something like that, you can imagine that if you cut tax rates from 90 to 80%, revenue would actually go up because people who just stopped working because they were taxed so heavily will start working now, right? So that could happen. But at least in the range of tax rates that countries like the United States have, where the marginal rates are below 40% for federal taxes, it just doesn't happen. So I don't know, that's less than 10 minutes, but that's a comment anyway. So yeah.
Actually, Professor, my question goes from the last comment that you were making earlier about how sometimes data fail us in a way. Like, so numbers are deceptive and figures, they project a different image. So just like the example that you're giving of US universities, the same thing we can, it's like there's an Indian university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, whose report on sexual harassment was cited in the Indian Parliament, whereby it was shown that they have such huge number of sexual harassment cases happening, when actually it is one of the only university, I'll say, which has a very much functional internal complaint committee working with a very proper redressal happening. So, so my question is that, yeah, when we are researching, we need to have a research objective, but then there are larger other objectives that we as researchers see in this world, the way it is and the way we want it to be. And sometimes in this, I find data to be playing a negative role. So, so we know that gender discrimination or caste discrimination in India is a very pervasive phenomenon. But still you have researchers which will tell you that the presence of women judges or the presence of Dalit judges is hardly making any difference. And then you have justifications for it. You understand that a woman judge has more pressure. She has to comply more with that gender norm, the way other male judges are reacting. The Dalit judge will have to react with that Brahminical thing which is underlined in the system. So how do we deal with it? Like, so does that mean that empirical research is bad when we are dealing with things like discrimination studies or social justice issues? Like yesterday there was a thing said that there are researchers which say that the larger number of judges does not affect it is not increasing the disposal rate of cases. So does that mean that we don't need more judges?
It might, yeah.
Yeah, so,
it might.
so like why such researches are happening, and what's the objective? And when we are talking about ethics, like, so we cannot really study the discrimination in employment because, like you said, that it will raise ethical issues if we send dummy black candidates to an interview. But we don't have any ethical issues involved when we are allowing researchers which are defying the purpose of social justice. Like sometimes I think this policy experiments that you said, like what is there to experiment? We know if there'll be better health conditions, we'll be good. Why do we need such things?
But we don't know whether there will be better health conditions. Like just because you implement some new policy that has good intentions, doesn't mean it will have good results, right? Health outcomes can go down. You have some policy. So take for example in the United States. A policy for the use of biofuels. So the idea is we want to reduce air pollution, we want to reduce dependence on petroleum, and so we're going to use ethanol made from corn and put that in our cars. In terms of environmental impact, so well-intentioned, like what could possibly be better than using less petrol and using corn instead? Oh, that sounds like such a good thing for the environment. If you look at the total environmental impact, corn is much worse than petrol. Like petrol, you take it out of the ground, you burn it, and it generates carbon dioxide, and that's bad. That's bad, yes, it's true. But the thing is with corn, you plant all this corn, you use all these resources to grow the corn, then you process the corn in a way that's very inefficient in terms of generating energy into ethanol. And then you put the ethanol in the cars. The cars don't run as efficiently, so they use more gas. And so by the time you're done, the total environmental impact is actually negative. It's actually worse. It made things worse. So it's not enough to say we had good intentions. I mean, I think the goal of the economist is to save humanity from its own good intentions sometimes. And so I think that's what empirical work can do, is it can say, look, just because we think this is a good idea doesn't mean it's a good idea. Now, having said that, you made two very important points at the beginning, and I don't want to forget about those either. So first you say, well, look, what about that report that was cited in Parliament as a way to criticize this school that was actually doing a good job? So that's a real problem, is the misuse of statistics, maybe even the deliberate misuse of statistics, right? I mean, there's this famous saying, I'm sure many of you have heard it, there are three types of lies. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? And there's a reason why statistics has that reputation, because they can be manipulated to look very bad, right? When they're not very bad, or vice versa. Okay, so that's So that's a real concern. And then you mentioned this concern about, what about women judges or Dalit judges? They have making no difference. Okay, so what about that? Okay, so I guess there are two things I would say in response to those. So with respect to the second one, well, it depends on what you mean by making no difference, right? And this is the whole idea of empirical studies can answer descriptive and positive questions. They can't answer normative questions. So when somebody says makes no difference, there's a dangerous ambiguity there. Do you mean makes no difference in terms of what you are measuring in your specific study? Or makes no difference as a normative matter, right? So it could be the case that a bench with a woman judge and a bench without a woman judge will decide every case exactly the same. So you might say, oh, it makes no difference having a woman judge on the bench. And as an empirical matter, if what I just said is empirically true in the data, then that's true with respect to the question asked, is does it affect the outcome of the case? But that's different from saying we don't need to have women judges on the bench, right? There are many reasons why you might want to have a woman judge on the bench, not that you want to change the outcome of cases. That might be one of the reasons. I'm not saying it doesn't have an effect. There's actually a lot of evidence from the United States that it does have a significant
But it's not
effect.
necessary that a women judge is a feminist.
That's
She might be
true.
biased towards women.
That's true. So there's a couple of things. So one is you have to make sure that you understand what's being measured by the empirical study. If you think what matters for women judges being on the bench is that, well, my goodness, we shouldn't be excluding people from an entire profession. And it might be really important for young people to have good role models who are both men and women, right? That has nothing to do with how cases are decided, right? Now, there's a second concern, right, which is, well, maybe the empirical data need to be examined more carefully, right? It's possible, for example, and this goes to what you were just saying a moment ago, that there may be some either omitted variables or selection effects. What if we live in a society in which the only women who get appointed to be judges are women who will not do anything different from the men? Well, then what we're detecting, we're saying there's no effect. Well, there's no effect not of having a woman on the bench, but there's no effect of having a woman on the bench who is a woman who will only decide cases the same way as men, right? So we have to be careful to make sure we understand the design of the empirical study and what is being captured by the study and what isn't. So, but I think it's, and this goes to answering the first part of your question, which is the political misuse and misuse of statistics. My view is it is much better to get the facts and confront the facts than to hide from the facts. Because I think a lot of advocates try to suppress information that looks not great for their side. And I think in the long run that just delegitimizes what they're promoting. So if you are an advocate, for greater women's rights in the legal profession, for example, if you're suppressing data on how women are performing in the legal profession, I think overall that's going to hurt you. Because what that means is one side of the argument is going to be bringing facts to bear, and the other side isn't. And if it turns out you're hiding facts, that's going to look really, really bad, right? But I think the way to deal with this, it's harder and it doesn't always work. Politics is a dirty business, and sometimes the bad guys win. It is to do the empirical analysis better than the people who would misuse it. And what that requires in a situation like the example you gave with the university report is, people who understand this have to explain to say, look, this sexual violence is a serious problem, but don't criticize this university because they had the guts to take steps that will lead to crimes being reported. It's only someone who understands how data can go wrong, right, can fix the misunderstanding of data. Because data is going to be misused, whether even if you try to suppress all the data you can, other people are going to produce data and they're going to misuse it. So I think it's better to fight bad data with good data than to try to suppress data altogether. Now, having said that, you're not always going to win the PR battle, right? I mean, it does look bad when you're a university. I mean, this is a problem. This is a problem universities have. I mean, there are administrators who really do want to do the right thing, but boy, they're like, this is really going to hurt us, you know, because public opinion. And so it's hard. But I do believe, you know, I do believe that one of the real values of having a stronger culture of empirical legal studies is that, you know, whether or not we're doing empirical research, the government's going to be citing statistics. And so the only thing that we can change isn't whether they cite the statistics, but whether they get called out when they're using it badly. You know, I think a big part of what all of us can do, even if we don't do our own empirical research, is to, with a critical eye, study the research that's being promoted publicly and be able to say, this is what's wrong with the conclusion that you're trying to draw. You know, I think that's a really important role that all of us can play. And, you know, that's why I focus a lot in these lectures on ways to criticize. Yeah. Because, you know, first we want to criticize our own work, you know, to make it better. But we also need to be vigilant to the mistakes other people make. So that's my speech about that. I mean, it's a very important question you raised. So I'm glad you asked. Okay, so I think we're kind of out of time, but we'll continue our conversation tomorrow. And I'll try to get here. I'll try to get here early, as you've probably seen. So if you have questions and want to just ask me questions beforehand, that's fine too. And I'll be around a little bit afterwards.